Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into one of the most, I think, fundamental questions about power and ethics that has really defined civilizations for thousands of years.
Right.
And it's this profound paradox. If you, as the most respected legal mind of your era, are offered the ultimate position of judicial power, a job that confers wealth, status, and, the authority to shape the law itself, why on earth would you refuse it?
And conversely, why would a highly placed government official, someone already at the pinnacle of power, choose a prisoner's cell, torture, or even execution over just signing a piece of paper or giving a political endorsement?
It seems completely illogical, doesn't it? When we think about defending the law, we usually think of procedures, filing motions, arguing constitutional points, relying on structural safeguards, checks and balances.
All the mechanics of it.
Exactly. But history, if you look closely at these true moments of crisis, it tells a very different story.
It really does. The sources we have today, they reveal a consistent, universal, and frankly, a far more powerful truth than mere procedure. Our deep dive today is built around the single powerful conclusion, the ultimate, the essential defense of judicial independence. It's often not found in legal procedures written in a constitution.
It's found somewhere else.
It is found always in the individual moral courage to refuse political power when that power demands loyalty over justice.
Exactly. Our stack of sources provides just a masterful comparative legal analysis linking three monumental, profound acts of personal defiance, and they span nearly 1,300 years. They cut across the early Islamic world, Reformation Europe, and modern Asia.
It's an incredible range.
It is. We are talking about the refusal of Imam Abu Hanifa in the 8th century, the martyrdom of Sir Thomas More in the 16th century, and then the stand taken by Chief Justice Iftikhar Chaudhry in the 21st century.
And that historical reach, from the Abbasid Caliphate to Tudor England to modern Pakistan, it just proves that the challenge to the judiciary is fundamentally the same, regardless of the system.
The details change, but the core conflict doesn't.
Never. The rulers change, the law evolves, but the core demand of the executive is constant. Submit your conscience to my will.
So our goal for you, the listener, is to move beyond seeing these men as just, historical footnotes, and to really internalize the universal principle that their defiance forged. And that is, a judge who cannot speak truth to power must not sit on the bench.
And that principle, it doesn't just apply to judges, it applies to anyone, really, tasked with upholding an objective standard.
That's a great point.
And we should stress that the structure of this deep dive, it's drawn directly from the analysis itself. We are looking at these historical flashpoints where the executive, be it a caliph, a king, or a military general, demanded total submission. They were aiming to make the judiciary a simple rubber stamp.
Right.
And in every single instance, the judiciary represented by one crucial individual had to decide. Was it merely an extension of the ruler's temporary political will, or was it fundamentally the eternal guardian of the law and of human conscience?
So before we jump into the first case, what is the single overarching principle that the sources argue unites these three disparate figures across millennia? What's the glue holding this analysis together?
What's truly compelling is how the analysis isolates the same essential non-legalistic element in every case. They are unequivocally clear about it.
And what is that?
Moral courage, not the complexity or depth of legal procedure, is the first, most essential pillar of judicial independence. You can legislate rules, you can write checks and balances, but those things, well, they can be rewritten. They can be suspended in a crisis.
But courage can't.
Courage is a fixed internal quality. It has to exist in the individual. And that personal integrity, that is the foundation we're exploring.
Okay, so let's begin where this tradition of high-stakes moral refusal begins. We go back to the 8th century CE with the foundational legal figure, Imam Abu Hanifa. He wasn't just a respected lawyer. His very approach fundamentally changed how Islamic law was practiced.
To really understand the weight of his refusal, you need to understand his intellectual standing. Abu Hanifa, who lived from 699 to 767 CE, is nothing short of a colossus in global jurisprudence.
He's not a minor figure.
Oh, not at all. He is the founder of the Hanafi school of jurisprudence, or fiqh, which even today governs the lives of hundreds of millions of people worldwide. We're talking about massive populations in Turkey, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. His school of thought is one of the most dominant in the world.
So he was a foundational legal and ethical force, not just in his own time, but for the next 13 centuries.
Precisely. And his influence didn't just come from specific legal rulings, but from his methodology. He was known for his systematic use of logic, analogical reasoning, what's known as qiyas, and critical interpretation to adapt sacred texts to new legal problems.
So he was a system builder.
A total system builder. This made him not just a man of authority, but a man who valued rational, independent judgment above everything else. And that is the intellectual core that makes his subsequent refusal so significant.
And the political climate he operated in was, what, pure chaos. He lived right through this bloody and tumultuous transition from the Umayyad dynasty to the Abbasid dynasty.
Volatile is an understatement. This was a period of violent regime change, civil war, mass purges. I mean, the establishment of a totally new political order, one that desperately needed to secure religious and legal legitimacy.
So the new guys in charge needed to look like they were the rightful rulers.
Exactly. The Abbasids had overthrown the Umayyads by appealing to religious piety and promising justice. So to solidify their power, they needed the endorsement of the most respected spiritual and legal scholars. They needed Abu Hanifa.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the dramatic offer. The new Abbasid Caliph, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, the man who founded Baghdad, he recognized Abu Hanifa's unparalleled legal standing and sought to co-opt it entirely.
Yes. The Caliph offered Abu Hanifa the position of chief judge, or Qadi al-Qudat. And we really need to pause and grasp the gravity of this title. This was not merely a Supreme Court justice.
That's a beggar.
The Qadi al-Qudat was essentially the head of the entire judicial system of the Caliphate, the most massive, powerful political entity of its day.
So he would have been responsible for setting legal standards, appointing every other judge across the empire, and advising the Caliph on all major legal and religious issues. It's immense power.
Absolutely immense. It guaranteed vast wealth, unparalleled status, and the ability to influence law across continents for generations. But, as you pointed out earlier, the offer came with a non-negotiable demand.
Poison pill.
The poison pill. A demand for personal fealty to the Caliph, essentially overriding any commitment to independent interpretation of the law.
And what was Abu Hanifa's response to this coercion? Our sources call it the ultimate expression of intellectual resistance.
He delivered a philosophical masterpiece of refusal right to the face of the most powerful man in the world. He looked at Caliph al-Mansur and said, "If you seek the truth, I am unfit. If you seek someone fit, I am honest enough to speak the truth."
Wow. Let's break that quote down, because it's not just defiance. It's a brilliant rhetorical maneuver that preemptively destroys the ruler's argument.
It is brilliant. He's essentially saying, you are seeking a judge who will find reasons to validate your political desires. If that is what you define as fit for the job, then I am indeed unfit because I will not compromise the truth.
And the other side of it.
And conversely, if you want someone who will speak the truth of the law, regardless of the consequences, the true definition of a fit judge, then I am too honest for the job you are actually offering. He made the job definition itself the problem.
He turned the tables completely. He forced the Caliph to admit, at least to himself, that he wasn't looking for justice. He was looking for a political puppet.
That's it.
This brings us to the crucial 5 core reasons that propel this refusal. Reasons that, when we look at them, sound like a blueprint for judicial ethics that are still relevant today.
They absolutely do. These reasons, which the sources highlight as setting the foundation for judicial autonomy, are not abstract. They speak to the immediate operational danger of fusing judicial power with executive will.
So let's take the first one. The Caliph explicitly demanded political loyalty. Why is that the ultimate poison pill for a judge?
Well, because the very purpose of a judge is to be impartial. If a judge takes an oath of loyalty to the executive, their entire ethical framework collapses.
It's over before it starts.
It is. Imagine a case coming before you where the interests of the Caliph conflict with the interests of a common subject. If your primary loyalty is political, the subject will always lose. Abu Hanifa understood that judicial independence is not just about what you rule, but who you serve.
And by demanding political loyalty, the Caliph was demanding servitude, not justice.
Precisely.
And the second point connects directly to the immediate functionality of the courts under the Abbasids.
That's right. Abu Hanifa could see that the judiciary was already being actively used for political persecution. The Abbasid regime, like any new regime built on blood, needed to silence dissenters and punish rivals.
So they needed the courts to do their dirty work.
They needed the courts to give it a legal gloss. By accepting the role of chief judge, Abu Hanifa would have put his monumental legal authority and his reputation behind the very instruments of oppression. He would have been legitimizing the persecution of innocent people under the guise of law.
Which is the worst kind of corruption.
The absolute worst.
Okay, the third reason outlines the structural collapse this acceptance would have formalized.
This is a constitutional point, really, even without a written constitution. Judges were actively being utilized as extensions of the executive branch. In any healthy system, the judiciary acts as a check.
Right.
If the Caliph can command the Qadi al-Qudat to rule a certain way, the check is gone. The law stops being a standard applied equally to all and becomes merely another tool of state administration, a dangerous instrument of the executive.
The fourth reason seems deeply personal, yet it speaks to the core integrity of the scholar. His fear was profound, being forced to approve or legitimize injustice.
And for a man whose entire life was dedicated to scholarship and the meticulous search for truth in the law, being forced to put his seal of approval on something he knew to be morally or legally wrong was an existential threat.
It's not just about his job.
No, it wasn't just about losing his job or even his life. It was about the absolute annihilation of his professional integrity and his reputation. That fear drove the refusal, the understanding that compromise is irreversible. Once you cross that line, you can't go back.
And finally, the broadest political point, summarizing the danger of his participation in the regime.
He fundamentally refused to provide legitimacy to oppressive governance. Rulers, especially those who come to power violently, they desperately need the veneer of law to maintain control and convince the public that their actions are righteous.
It's a form of propaganda.
A very powerful form. By refusing to lend his unparalleled moral and legal authority to the Abbasid court, Abu Hanifa stripped their potentially unjust actions of that vital legal legitimacy. His refusal was, in essence, an act of intellectual and moral delegitimization against the state.
Now here's where the narrative tension truly ramps up. You don't just tell an absolute ruler like Caliph al-Mansur that he's asking for a puppet and walk away.
No.
What was the immediate, brutal consequence of this high-stakes defiance?
The cost was immediate and devastating. The Caliph, who had just spent enormous energy consolidating his rule, could not tolerate this public and absolute rejection by the most respected legal figure in the Islamic world. In a rage, he imprisoned Abu Hanifa.
And the imprisonment. I'm guessing it was not a comfortable political exile.
Far from it. The sources are clear that the Caliph attempted to break him. He was subjected to reported torture, a horrific humiliation and punishment designed to force his submission and acceptance of the judicial post. This was a direct physical assault on the very idea of intellectual autonomy.
And tragically, his story ends with the ultimate sacrifice.
He died in custody, maintaining his refusal until the very end. This singular act, refusing the highest office, enduring torture, and dying in prison rather than compromising his judicial and moral independence, did two things simultaneously.
What were they?
It established him as a definitive martyr for the rule of law, and it set the earliest known, most powerful precedent of judicial moral autonomy in Islamic history. His death was proof that the law must stand above the ruler.
So his refusal wasn't just a moment of personal bravery. It became the constitutional standard for subsequent generations of scholars. It established that high bar. A judge must be independent to the point of being willing to suffer for that independence.
Absolutely. It created an ethical legacy that echoed for centuries.
But it's too easy to keep these monumental acts locked away in history books. And this is what I find so compelling about our sources, how they immediately pivot across 7 centuries and a vast cultural divide to demonstrate that this profound challenge to judicial integrity is absolutely universal.
It's a perfect transition. Let's shift our gaze now to 16th century London and the case of Sir Thomas More.
Sir Thomas More stands as the towering figure of conscience in the Western legal tradition. His position, Lord Chancellor of England, it mirrored the immense stature of Abu Hanifa's offered position, the pinnacle of the English legal system, combining executive, administrative, and judicial functions.
He was a renowned humanist, a scholar, a lawyer, but just like Abu Hanifa, he lived during a period of intense political and spiritual upheaval. In this case, it was King Henry VIII's obsession with a male heir and the subsequent break with the Roman Catholic Church, the English Reformation.
The king was pushing boundaries that had been set for 1,000 years. To achieve his divorce from Catherine of Aragon and Mary Anne Boleyn, he needed to essentially declare himself sovereign not just over the state, but over the church in England.
Precisely. The defining flashpoint for More, the moment of coercion, came with the 1534 Act of Supremacy. Now, Henry VIII wasn't offering More a job like the Caliph did. He was demanding that More and every other key official sign an oath.
What exactly did that act of supremacy demand that was so existentially threatening to More's conscience?
It demanded that all subjects recognize the king, Henry VIII, as the supreme head of the Church of England. And you have to understand, this was not a minor administrative change. It was a fundamental seismic shift in Western Christendom.
Is a revolution.
It was a revolution, and for a deeply devout Catholic like More, signing the act was not just a political endorsement. It was a denial of the spiritual authority of the Pope and, in his eyes, a denial of his own eternal salvation. It was a mandatory spiritual compromise demanded by the state.
So if Abu Hanifa refused the power because it demanded he corrupt the law, More refused the oath because it demanded he corrupt his soul.
That's a perfect way to frame it.
The mechanism of defiance is the refusal to compromise a higher standard for the sake of political expediency.
Exactly. More refused to sign the oath. He spent enormous energy trying to avoid an explicit confrontation, maintaining a public silence, hoping to live within the law without outright repudiating the king. But when silence was no longer an option, he chose principle over political authority.
And this defiance, refusing to give his moral endorsement to the king's claim, sealed his fate.
It did. By refusing the oath, he implicitly questioned the king's legitimacy as head of the church, which was swiftly interpreted as high treason. The consequences were brutal and swift: imprisonment in the Tower of London.
And the sources capture the moment of his execution in 1535 with that famous line, one that defines the entire concept of servant leadership.
A line for the ages. "I die the king's good servant, but God's first."
That quote is so often repeated, but it's full weight. The fact that he acknowledged his fealty to the temporal ruler even while walking to the block, it shows the nuance of his stand. He wasn't a rebel, he was a man following a different law.
That's it. He was recognizing the validity of the king's temporal authority while simultaneously insisting that there is a higher moral authority that the state cannot penetrate or demand submission to. It's a profound distinction.
Let's follow the sources and bring these two figures together now. They're separated by nearly 1,000 years, completely different legal and religious systems, yet their actions run parallel. It's almost uncanny.
The parallels are striking when you focus on the act of refusal. Abu Hanifa refused the immense power of the Qadi al-Qudat under a coercive ruler. More refused to endorse the king's fundamental claim to religious and political supremacy via the oath.
And in both cases, the state demanded a single personal action that would have legitimized executive overreach.
A signature. An acceptance.
A single act of submission. And in both cases, the state reacted with maximum violence.
Both were imprisoned.
And both suffered the ultimate consequence. Abu Hanifa died in custody, establishing a standard for judicial independence through martyrdom. More was executed, establishing a standard for moral integrity and the supremacy of conscience over state power. The distinction in motivation is subtle, but it's critical for you, the listener, to grasp. Abu Hanifa's focus was on placing the law above the ruler, ensuring impartial justice for everyone.
Right, an external objective standard.
More focused on placing conscience above the king's legislative demand, a more internal standard. But the shared root is the refusal to compromise fundamental personal integrity when state power attempts to absorb that integrity.
The resulting principle, therefore, isn't about fiqh or tutor law. It transcends the specific legal system. Both men demonstrated with their lives that moral resistance is the highest form of judicial leadership. They didn't win in a court of law. The state successfully convicted them, but they cemented an ethical precedent that remains unassailable globally.
It provides the ethical template. If the system cannot defend you, your conscience must defend the system.
That's a powerful summary.
So we've established the ancients and the early modern precedents for this moral stand. It's easy to dismiss these stories as, historical curiosities, things that happened a long time ago.
Right, that can never happen now.
Exactly. But our sources argue that this same exact choice, this moment of existential pressure on a single judge, was forced upon a judge in the modern era, 1,300 years after Abu Hanifa. We jump straight to the 21st century. Pakistan in 2007, and the case of Chief Justice Iftikhar Muhammad Chaudhry.
This case is extraordinary because it mirrors the ancient scenario so perfectly, yet with modern political mechanisms. In 2007, Pakistan was governed by General Pervez Musharraf, who was ruling as both the military chief and the president.
So a classic executive overreach where the military and civilian structures were fused.
Completely fused, the judiciary, specifically the Supreme Court, represented the last significant check on his power.
And as the head of that last check, Chief Justice Iftikhar Chaudhry was the direct target.
Absolutely. The moment of coercion came on the 9th of March, 2007. General Musharraf summoned Chaudhry to his military office. This wasn't a formal court process. This was a direct executive demand delivered behind closed doors.
Intimidation.
Pure intimidation. Musharraf, operating outside the constitutional mandate, demanded Chaudhry's immediate resignation.
Wait, if the general was the de facto ruler, couldn't he have simply dismissed him? Why the need for a resignation?
Ah, and that's the key point. It echoes the need for legitimacy felt by the Caliph and the king. Dismissing the Chief Justice outright would have been a blatant, undeniable act of military force. It would have damaged Musharraf's carefully constructed facade of civilian rule.
He needed cover.
He needed cover. Demanding a resignation allowed Musharraf to claim that the Chief Justice had voluntarily stepped down due to misconduct, thus sanitizing the coup and maintaining the veneer of constitutional order. The resignation was the modern equivalent of signing the king's oath or accepting the caliph's poison job offer.
It was the request for personal self-destruction to provide legitimacy to the executive.
Perfectly put.
So what was Chaudhry's answer to this demand for immediate capitulation? Did he follow the path of least resistance?
He did not. His reason for defiance was explicitly clear and rooted in the very principles we've been tracing since the 8th century. He refused to resign, making it clear that his refusal was specifically aimed at preventing executive control over the judiciary.
He knew what was at stake.
He knew that submitting would instantly signal that the highest court was merely a wing of the military government, rendering the entire system of constitutional checks meaningless.
So like Abu Hanifa refusing the job, and Thomas More refusing the oath, Chaudhry refused the demand for resignation. He chose principle over power, standing completely alone at that moment against the absolute military authority of the state.
The consequences followed immediately, although they were contemporary. The general publicly suspended Chaudhry from office, using the flimsy pretext of a reference alleging misuse of authority. He was essentially placed under house arrest, his public movement restricted, and the military government attempted to install an acting Chief Justice who would toe the line.
This is the point where the 21st century story diverges significantly from the fate of the two earlier historical figures. Instead of leading to execution or death in custody, Chaudhry's solitary defiance ignited an unprecedented professional and public backlash.
And this is where the profound power of moral precedent comes into play. Chaudhry's refusal, because it was so morally clear and so precisely mirrored that classic executive demand for submission, it instantly resonated. It triggered a massive, organized, nationwide lawyers' movement.
And this wasn't just a small-scale protest. We're talking about a genuine upheaval.
A total upheaval. Lawyers, symbolized by their black coats, marched across the country. The public, starved for a true stand against the military regime, joined them in droves. Chaudhry's solitary act was transformed into a national movement for constitutionalism and the rule of law.
So his defiance provided the moral anchor for massive civil disobedience.
Yes. It created a fundamental crisis of legitimacy for Musharraf's regime, a crisis that the military government, despite its power, could not suppress with sheer force.
Why not?
Because the moral high ground had been seized by the Chief Justice.
Wow.
The sustained pressure, which lasted for nearly 2 years and was fueled by the moral clarity of the Chief Justice's initial refusal, led to the ultimate successful victory: the restoration of the judiciary in 2009.
A real victory.
A real, tangible victory. The sources beautifully synthesize this outcome. Chaudhry's defiance restored judicial independence, cemented public trust in the courts, and, critically, reestablished the constitutional balance of power against executive overreach.
The sources explicitly label this event as a modern reenactment of Abu Hanifa's moral courage. It demonstrates that the tactic of the ruler demanding personal submission from the judiciary is indeed timeless, and so too is the appropriate response.
Which is individual moral defiance leading to institutional salvation.
And this modern example completes the cycle of analysis perfectly.
It does. Abu Hanifa provided the original moral standard. Thomas More confirmed its universality in the West by linking it to conscience. And Chaudhry demonstrated that even against modern, entrenched military power, that individual moral refusal can still succeed. not just by martyrdom, but by mobilizing constitutional democracy and securing institutional victory.
We have meticulously traced this thread of defiance across three vast geopolitical landscapes and over a millennium of history. Now, let's leverage the analytical framework provided by the sources to truly compare, consolidate, and extract the lasting, actionable lessons from these three eras.
This comparative synthesis is the intellectual payoff of the deep dive. Despite the obvious cultural and chronological chasm, early Islamic scholar, Catholic lawyer in Reformation England, and a Chief Justice in a modern republic, they all upheld the same fundamental truth, although they articulated it through slightly different constitutional principles relevant to their time.
Okay, let's break down the specific principle each man ultimately upheld against the state's coercion. Starting again with Abu Hanifa, what was his core principle?
Abu Hanifa's principle was the most structural and foundational. The judiciary must be independent. His act was preemptive. It was a refusal to even contaminate his personal integrity by joining a system he knew was fundamentally flawed and politically coercive.
He wouldn't even step into the ring.
Exactly. By refusing the job, he ensured that his powerful intellectual authority could not be used to corrupt the institution of law itself. He put the institution first by prioritizing his own incorruptibility.
Then, moving to Thomas More, whose stand was rooted in the individual's inner life.
Thomas More's principle focused on the internal moral compass. Conscience is above political authority. While the immediate context was religious, the supremacy of the Pope versus the king, the mechanism of defiance applies universally.
How so?
He refused to accept a state demand that violated his deepest moral convictions. This established the crucial idea that the state cannot demand total personal submission. There must be a private, inviolable sphere of integrity, which is, of course, the intellectual engine room of true judicial independence.
And finally, Chaudhry, operating within the defined framework of a written, albeit contested, constitutional democracy.
Chaudhry's principle was explicit and institutional. The Constitution is above the executive. He wasn't just defending his personal conscience, though that was clearly involved. He was defending the institutional arrangement laid out in the Pakistani Constitution against naked military encroachment.
So he was defending the document itself.
He understood that defending the written constitutional order was the direct 21st century iteration of speaking truth to power. He chose the text of the law over the temporary power of the general.
So we see a progression here. It's almost an evolution of the same idea. From establishing the structural need for independence with Hanifa
Right.
to defining the internal moral source of that independence with More, to applying it to the written framework of democracy with Chaudhry. Is that a fair way to see it?
That's a beautiful synthesis provided by the sources. The unifying theme running through all three cases is that the ultimate failure of justice is not a procedural error, but a moral compromise. The analysis argues persuasively that when judges refuse to compromise, nations move toward justice. The individual act of refusal, whether it leads to martyrdom or mobilization, creates the necessary space for justice to operate.
Now we need to look at the massive, long-term historical impact of each refusal. Because their defiance was not self-serving. It fundamentally altered the legal and political landscape for generations after them.
The impact of Abu Hanifa's sacrifice was immediate and enduring within his tradition. His actions profoundly strengthened Islamic judicial ethics. His example became the definitive gold standard.
The ultimate moral shield.
Exactly. For countless scholars and judges who, over the centuries, faced similar pressures from caliphs, sultans, and kings, it made it ethically impossible for a Muslim ruler to demand obedience from a judge without invoking the memory of his martyrdom and the subsequent ethical backlash.
And Thomas More's defiance had an equally massive, though distinctly Western impact.
More's martyrdom significantly shaped Western constitutionalism. Though Henry VIII won the immediate battle by establishing the Church of England, More's stand solidified the idea that there is a realm of internal conviction conscience that the state cannot legitimately demand control over.
And that idea is foundational to everything that came after.
It is. It's foundational to protections of individual rights, the eventual establishment of judicial review, and the development of the separation of powers, where the law must stand above the monarch or the state.
And in the modern context, the institutional impact of Chaudhry's refusal was the most immediate and tangible.
Pakistan's 2007 judicial movement fundamentally reshaped constitutional democracy in that nation. It was a massive demonstration that the judiciary, when backed by the moral clarity of its leadership and the public will, is capable of forcing a retreat by the executive, even a military
And
one.
it changed public perception.
It created a deep-seated public expectation for judicial independence, a new, unwritten covenant between the judiciary and the people that is now a permanent part of the national political narrative.
So after analyzing these three monumental acts of defiance, spanning a millennium and crossing 3 continents, what is the core lesson, the absolute ratio decidendi, that the source material leaves us with?
The final, ultimate conclusion derived from the sources is simple, elegant, and, well, chillingly relevant. Judicial independence begins not in the courtroom, but in the courage of those who refuse to be controlled.
Say that again.
Judicial independence begins not in the courtroom, but in the courage of those who refuse to be controlled. Independence is not a set of administrative rules. It is an act of individual moral will.
That is a powerful conclusion. It forces you to realize that you can have the most flawlessly written constitution with perfect rules on appointments and tenure. But if the individuals tasked with enforcing it lack that core moral spine, the Constitution is, at the moment of crisis, utterly worthless.
It's just paper.
The procedure protects the institution only so long as the judge first protects their own moral integrity.
Exactly. When the pressure comes, and these cases prove that the pressure always comes from the executive demanding personal loyalty, the judge cannot consult a statute book to find the answer. They have to consult their conscience. That personal capacity for refusal is the ultimate non-legislated check and balance.
We started by posing a paradox. Why refuse the greatest power? And I think we've resolved it. The final takeaway for you, the listener, is the absolute necessity of that moral choice in any system of governance.
It is the stark choice between bowing to power, which instantly destroys justice by turning the law into a tool of oppression, and standing firm, which becomes justice. It establishes an unshakable precedent for future generations to stand upon.
It constantly reinforces our main lesson, that while legal procedure is the engine and the mechanism of justice, moral courage, displayed at the moment of highest pressure, is the essential foundation, the bedrock upon which all true judicial independence ultimately rests.
And that leads us to the final thought we wanted to leave you with, one that builds directly on the history we've explored. If the 3 case studies, from Abu Hanifa to Thomas More to Iftikhar Chaudhry, show us that the ultimate threat to justice always originates from political leaders demanding personal loyalty and submission,
Which they always do.
it raises a crucial question for every modern democracy. Since moral courage cannot be guaranteed in every person, what mechanisms beyond individual moral defiance can a modern constitution build into the system, in terms of judicial appointment, tenure, and financial structure, to protect judges from being tempted or coerced by power?
The ultimate question for constitutional designers: can you legislate against human temptation and political coercion, or will the fate of justice always come down to the strength of a single individual's spine? That is something truly worth mulling over the next time you hear a news report about judicial decisions.
Indeed, a question that never loses its relevance.
Thank you for guiding us through this fascinating and profound deep dive into the true cost and meaning of judicial independence.
Always a pleasure.